The soft drizzle of rain whispered against the cobblestone streets of Washington, weaving a melancholy symphony that Alina Lewis had come to find strangely comforting during her 7 years in the city. Today, the weather mirrored her heart, steady yet unrelenting, pressing forward despite the weight of sorrow it carried. Adjusting the worn name tag pinned to her uniform, she tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear before pushing open the back door of Golden Memories Cafe. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of maple syrup. A morning ritual that had remained unchanged, even when her world felt like it was unraveling. "Morning, Ez," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that masked the exhaustion beneath. Behind the counter, Salvador, the cafe's seasoned cook, was already at work, flipping golden pancakes with the precision of a man who had been doing it for decades. He glanced up, his weathered face softening with a familiar kindness. "Hey, sunshine, how's our little man today?" he asked, his deep voice laced with concern. Alina forced a smile, though it wavered at the edges. "The doctors say he's stable. No worse, no better." She tied her apron around her waist with practiced ease, the simple motion offering a sense of control in a life that often felt like it was slipping through her fingers. What she didn't tell Salvador was that she had spent another sleepless night at her kitchen table, counting and recounting her savings for the 5th time that week. That the towering stack of medical bills seemed to grow overnight. That the life-saving surgery her son so desperately needed remained painfully out of reach. Exactly $1,350 out of reach. Salvador slid a steaming cup of coffee toward her. "You're opening the register today?" Alina nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup as though it could transfer some of its warmth into the cold pit of worry settled in her chest. Her fingers instinctively brushed against the half-medallion of St. Jude hanging from a delicate silver chain around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin, as if absorbing the heat of her silent prayers. "Zara always said St. Jude watches over impossible cases," she murmured under her breath, her words barely more than a breath against the rim of her cup. And if anyone was an impossible case right now, it was her 7-year-old son Robert, confined to a hospital bed, his frail heart battling against time itself. As she moved through the familiar motions of preparing the cafe for opening, her thoughts drifted to the woman who had once been her guiding light. Zara Fletcher. She had stepped in when life had ripped away Alina's last semblance of family, taking her in after her Aunt Milla passed when she was just 15. But Zara had been so much more than a guardian. She had been Elena's unwavering rock, her compass when she felt lost, the voice of reason when the world seemed too cruel to bear. 3 years had passed since cancer stole Zara away, yet the ache of her absence remained as sharp as ever. There were still moments, especially on nights like last night, when Elena's first instinct was to pick up the phone and call her, to hear her steady voice tell her it was going to be okay. "You've got your mother's strength," Zara used to say. Alina had never been sure whether she had meant her biological mother, Mila, or herself. But it didn't matter. Strength was the one thing she had no choice but to hold on to. And today, like every day, she would. Across town, in a sleek high-rise overlooking the shimmering skyline, Grayson Peterson stood motionless by the towering windows, watching the rain carve winding trails down the glass. The city stretched before him, a glittering expanse of power and progress, monuments to ambition, much like the empire he had built. At 52, he had everything society defined as success: a thriving business, a reputation that commanded respect, and wealth so vast it bordered on excess. And yet, on days like today, none of it mattered. Because today marked the anniversary of 27 years. Somehow, time had both dulled and sharpened the grief. Some days the loss felt like a distant ache, a shadow lingering at the edge of his consciousness. Other days, days like today, it hit him with the full force of a wound torn open anew. He could still see her, Mila, the way she had smiled at him that morning, her dark curls tumbling over her shoulders as she kissed him goodbye. She had been 5 months pregnant, glowing, full of life. And then, she was gone. The coastal highway had been slick with rain, the storm unforgiving. The authorities had searched for days, but the ravine had swallowed her car whole, leaving him with nothing but shattered memories and an empty grave marked only by a memorial stone. Grayson exhaled, pressing his fingertips against his temple before slipping a hand into his wallet. His fingers found the familiar compartment, the smooth metal cool against his skin. Half of a St. Jude medallion, the patron saint of lost causes. His lips curled into a bitter smile. How fitting. He and Mila had split the medallion just weeks before the accident, a promise etched in faith and love. "As long as we each have half, we'll never truly be apart," she had whispered, pressing the chain into his palm. His phone vibrated, shattering the silence. "Mr. Peterson," his assistant Margaret said crisply, "the board is waiting for your final decision on the Portland acquisition." He let out a slow breath. Business, the one constant in his life. "Tell them I'll have an answer by the end of the day. I need to review some details first." "Understood. And sir, your $3,000 meeting with the foundation has been confirmed." Grayson gave a small nod, though Margaret couldn't see it. The charitable foundation he had established in Mila's name was the only endeavor that still felt meaningful, a way to honor the woman who had once been his entire world. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll be heading out shortly." He gathered the thick file on the Portland property acquisition, a cluster of downtown buildings including a handful of small businesses, prime for redevelopment, a strategic move yet. As he glanced outside, watching the storm intensify, a thought crossed his mind. Would Mila have approved? The rain pounded against the windows now, a relentless downpour. Grayson grabbed his umbrella and stepped toward the door. Perhaps a change of scenery would help clear his mind, or perhaps on a day like today, nothing truly could. By mid-morning, Golden Memories Cafe was alive with the familiar hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifting through the air. Elena moved effortlessly between tables, refilling cups and delivering orders with a practiced grace, her ever-present smile warm but lacking the spark of true joy. Every bill and coin that slipped into her apron pocket was silently tallied, each tip bringing her a fraction closer to the surgery Robert so desperately needed. "Careful, honey. That's hot," she cautioned, setting down a plate of golden French toast before an elderly customer, her voice tinged with the same gentle care she reserved for her son. The bell above the door jingled and Elena instinctively glanced up. A man had stepped inside, shaking the rain from his umbrella. His presence commanded attention, not through any ostentatious display but in the quiet, assured way he carried himself. He was well-dressed, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the cozy, unpretentious atmosphere of the cafe. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, haunted, distant, as if he carried the weight of something time had failed to heal. "Table for one, sir?" Elena asked, approaching him with a menu in hand. "Please," he replied, his voice smooth yet subdued. She led him to a quiet corner by the window, the soft patter of rain against the glass adding to the cafe's gentle ambiance. "Our special today is Belgian waffles with mixed berries," she offered. "Can I start you with some coffee?" "Black coffee would be perfect, thank you." As she moved to fetch his drink, Elena couldn't help but notice the way he seemed distracted, his attention divided between the stack of papers spread across the table and the rain-slicked streets beyond the window. When she returned, setting the steaming mug before him, he barely glanced at the menu before speaking. "Just toast and eggs, over easy, coming right up." She hesitated for a brief moment before asking, "Mr. Peterson," he supplied. "Grayson Peterson." The name tugged at something in Elena's memory, a faint whisper of familiarity she couldn't quite place. But she let it go. In her line of work, she encountered countless names and faces, most fading into the blur of daily routine. Grayson, meanwhile, had already turned his focus back to his documents, property assessments, zoning permits, financial projections. Among them were details on a particular set of downtown buildings he was considering acquiring. One of them housed this very cafe. For weeks he had put off making a final decision. The numbers made sense. The redevelopment would be lucrative, and yet, something had held him back. Now, sitting here, he understood why. There was something about this place, something genuine, something real, a warmth that couldn't be measured in square footage or projected revenue, a feeling that no sleek modern bistro could replicate. And for the first time in a long while, Grayson found himself hesitating, not out of business strategy but for reasons he couldn't quite define. Eleanor returned with his order just as Grayson's phone buzzed against the table. He answered it with his usual brisk efficiency, his focus shifting to the voice on the other end. Meanwhile, she carefully arranged his plate, ensuring everything was just right before stepping back. But in her haste, the toe of her sneaker caught on the leg of a neighboring chair. Time slowed. She lurched forward, bumping into Grayson's table. The impact sent his coffee cup teetering to the edge before it tipped, spilling dark liquid in a widening pool across his neatly stacked documents. Alina gasped, her stomach dropping. "Oh no! I'm so sorry," she stammered, fumbling for napkins from her apron pocket. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. I wasn't looking where—" She reached forward instinctively, dabbing at the mess, but her fingers trembled with embarrassment. Grayson's initial flicker of irritation faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. "It's fine," he said, his tone gentler than she expected. He grabbed a few napkins himself, dabbing at the papers. "Nothing irreplaceable." As she leaned in to blot the spill, the delicate chain around her neck shifted, and something slipped free from beneath her uniform. A small, worn medallion that caught the light for the briefest second. Grayson stilled, his breath hitched as his gaze locked onto the familiar shape, the aged medal bearing the distinct engraving he had memorized long ago, the unique edge, the faded image of St. Jude, the hand-carved pattern, unchanged by time. For nearly 3 decades he had carried its twin in his wallet. His hand, mid-motion, froze. Alina, oblivious to his reaction, continued apologizing. "I'll get you fresh coffee right away, and of course your meal is on the house today." But Grayson barely heard her. His world had just tilted on its axis. "Your necklace," he said, his voice suddenly rough, like he was speaking through a dust-coated memory. "May I ask where you got it?" Elena's fingers instinctively curled around the pendant. She hesitated before answering. "It was my mother's," she said cautiously. "Well, my adoptive mother's. She gave it to me before she passed away." A slow, measured breath filled Grayson's lungs. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Your adoptive mother?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Elena confirmed. "Zara Fletcher. She raised me after my aunt died." Zara Fletcher. The name meant nothing to him. But the medallion meant everything. It couldn't be a coincidence. The piece was one of a kind, custom-made for him and Mila all those years ago. Before he could press further, Elena's phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced at the screen, her expression instantly tightening with worry. "I need to take this, it's the hospital," she said, stepping away hurriedly. "My son, he's not well, I'll send someone else with your fresh coffee." And just like that, she was gone, weaving through the cafe toward the staff counter, her voice urgent as she spoke into the phone. Grayson remained frozen in his seat, his mind a storm of impossible theories. Then, without thinking, he rose and followed her. "Yes, doctor. How much more would it cost to move up the surgery?" Elena pressed her phone tighter against her ear, her free hand gripping the edge of the counter as though it could hold back the wave of helplessness threatening to consume her. A brief silence, then the doctor's response. "I see. Yes, I understand. I'm close, I just need a little more time to gather the rest." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened where she clutched the phone. When she hung up, she exhaled shakily, pressing her fingertips against her temples. Just a little more time. But time was the one thing Robert didn't have. A soft but deliberate clearing of a throat made her turn. Grayson stood a few steps away, his expression unreadable yet filled with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing," he said carefully. "Your son is in the hospital?" Elena hesitated, caught between exhaustion and the instinct to keep personal matters private. "Yes," she admitted, eyes wary. "Robert has a congenital heart condition. He needs surgery, but—" She trailed off, shifting uncomfortably. What business was this of his? Grayson watched her for a moment before speaking again, his voice lower, tinged with something almost regretful. "I'm sorry to pry," he said. "It's just, I lost someone to heart issues many years ago. If there's anything I can do to help—" For a fleeting moment, Elena's carefully maintained composure cracked. The tired mother beneath the polite waitress surfaced, her eyes dark with worry, her lips parting as if she might actually let herself lean on the kindness of a stranger. But then the moment passed. She shook her head, forcing a small, polite smile. "That's very kind, but we'll manage." I should get back to work." Grayson nodded, recognizing the wall she had built around herself. He returned to his table without another word. When he left, he placed a generous tip with his bill. But before stepping out into the rain, he paused at the counter, requesting a private word with the manager. That evening, as Elena finished her shift and retreated to the empty employee locker room, she found an unmarked envelope sitting inside her locker. Curious, she reached for it, her breath catching as she peeled back the flap. Inside, crisp bills stared back at her. She counted them once, then again, and then a third time just to be sure. Exactly $1,000. Not a dollar more, not a dollar less. The precise amount she needed. Her vision blurred as emotion crashed over her in a tidal wave. A sob broke free, raw and unguarded as she clutched the envelope to her chest. Who? How could anyone possibly know? Her hands trembled as she wiped her tears, overwhelmed by both gratitude and confusion. The locker room door creaked open. "Jen, you still here?" Hess's familiar voice filled the space. His head poked through the doorway, his sharp gaze immediately softening when he saw the tears glistening on her cheeks. "Hey," he said gently, stepping inside. "What's wrong?" But Elena could only shake her head, pressing the envelope against her heart as if afraid it might disappear. Outside, in the silent darkness, Grayson Peterson sat behind the wheel of his car, staring at the warm glow of the cafe through the rain-streaked windshield. The other half of the medallion burned in his pocket, its weight heavier than it had ever felt before. For 28 years he had lived in emptiness, and now, for the first time, he felt alive with purpose. And utterly terrified of what he might uncover, Elena held up the envelope, her fingers trembling. "Someone left this for me. It's exactly what I need for Robert's surgery." S's brows shot up in disbelief. "What? You're kidding. Who would—" "I don't know," she whispered, shaking her head. Her eyes brimmed with fresh tears as she clutched the envelope closer. "There's no note, no explanation, just the money?" S let out a low whistle, leaning against the doorframe. "Well, whoever it was, they're a damn angel." Then, after a thoughtful pause, he added, "Maybe it was that guy in the suit. The one who spilled his coffee all over the table. He was asking Carol a lot of questions after you stepped away to take that call." Elena's breath caught. Grayson Peterson, his piercing stare, the way his expression had shifted when he saw her medallion, the quiet intensity in his voice when he asked about her family. Could it have been him? But how? How would he have known the exact amount she needed? Her heart pounded as possibilities raced through her mind. "I need to find out who it was," she said, determination sharpening her voice. Carefully, she tucked the envelope into her purse. "I have to thank them." S studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Some people prefer to stay anonymous. Maybe they don't want recognition. Maybe they just wanted to help." His lips quirked in a knowing smile. "You ever think about just being grateful and paying it forward someday?" Elena nodded absently, but her mind was already far ahead of the conversation. If it was Grayson Peterson, why would a wealthy businessman, someone who had no reason to care, take such an interest in a waitress and her sick child? And why had he looked at her medallion as though it held the answers to a question he had spent a lifetime asking? Across town, in a dimly lit hotel suite, Grayson Peterson sat motionless on the edge of his bed, the half medallion resting in his open palm. Its once sharp edges had been worn smooth by time, softened by years of being carried in his wallet, thumbed over and over, like a talisman for a prayer that had never been answered. But today, he had seen its twin, hanging around the neck of a woman he had never met, yet felt somehow that he had known forever. Could it really be? He exhaled the words like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. After all these years? He turned to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys, before typing with slow deliberation, Zara Fletcher, Portland. Dozens of search results flooded the screen. Most were insignificant, business listings, social media profiles, unrelated articles. But then, a single line made his pulse stutter. Obituary. Published 3 years ago. His hand tightened around the medallion as a sense of inevitability settled over him. Whatever truth lay ahead, he could feel it drawing him in like a tide. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Grayson clicked on the obituary, his eyes scanning the text with growing urgency. Zara Fletcher, 63, beloved nurse at Portland Memorial Hospital for over 31 years, passed away after a brave battle with cancer. She is survived by her adopted daughter, Elena Lewis. His breath caught. Zara had spent decades working in the pediatric ward, known for her unwavering dedication to the children in her care. But one line stood out like a beacon, sending a cold shiver through his spine. She was among the first responders during the coastal highway disaster 28 years ago, the very accident that had supposedly claimed Mila's life. Grayson's pulse pounded in his ears. Zara Fletcher had worked at the hospital where victims of that crash were taken. Elena had Zara's half of the medallion, the one that should have been buried with Mila. And Elena, she looked to be in her mid-20s, the right age, the right timeline. She could have been born just before the accident. It was impossible, wasn't it? The authorities had been so certain. They had told him both Mila and the baby had perished. There had been a funeral, a memorial stone. He had mourned them for 28 years. Grayson's hand tightened around his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button before he hesitated. What would he even say? "Excuse me, I think you might be my long-lost daughter." She would think he was insane. No, he needed more information before confronting her. If this was real, if there was even the slightest chance, he had to be sure. Tomorrow he would go to the hospital where Zara Fletcher had worked. Someone there might remember something from that night all those years ago. He just had to hope the truth hadn't been buried along with her. Across town, in a dimly lit hospital room, Elena sat beside Robert's bed, absently running her fingers through his soft, sandy brown hair as he slept. The steady beeping of the monitor filled the silence, a quiet reassurance that his heart was still fighting. "We're going to get you that surgery, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone sent us a miracle." She thought about all the nights she had sat here, watching his fragile chest rise and fall, terrified that each breath might be his last. Robert had inherited the same rare congenital heart condition she had been born with, a defect that had required surgery when she was just days old. Her fingers traced absent-mindedly over her thigh, where a barely visible scar remained, the only physical reminder of the operation that had saved her life. She had been so lucky, and now, against all odds, so was Robert. But what if luck had nothing to do with it? What if it was something else entirely? Zara had always been evasive when it came to Elena's biological parents. "Your mother was my dear friend," she would say, her voice warm yet distant. "She loved you very much, but she couldn't take care of you." Elena had long assumed that her biological mother was Mila, the woman she had known as her aunt growing up. It made sense. Mila had lived with them for as long as she could remember, until the night of the accident that had claimed her life, when Elena was 16. But Zara had never explicitly confirmed it, and after her death, Elena found herself with more questions than answers. A memory surfaced, her final conversation with Zara, spoken in hushed tones between labored breaths as the cancer consumed her frail body. "Jenny," Zara had murmured, using the childhood nickname only she had ever called Elena. "In my closet, there's a cherrywood box with flowers carved on the lid. Inside you'll find the other things I saved for you, including the medallion." Elena had found the box exactly where Zara had said, tucked away like a long-forgotten secret. When she lifted the lid, nestled among old photographs and keepsakes, was a silver chain bearing half of a St. Jude medallion. Aged, worn, and impossibly familiar. "It was your mother's," Zara had said, her tired eyes soft with remembrance. "She wore it every day. Before she died, she asked me to give it to you when you were ready." Elena had frowned. Ready for what? Zara's gaze had drifted, as though seeing something far beyond the present. To find the other half. She had squeezed Elena's hand, surprising her with a final flicker of strength. "Promise me you'll wear it. Someday, it will lead you where you need to go." At the time, Elena had dismissed it as the rambling of a dying woman. She had worn the medallion to honor Zara's memory, not because she believed in its supposed purpose. But now, she wasn't so sure. Beside her, Robert stirred, pulling her back to the present. "Mom," he mumbled sleepily, his small hand shifting beneath the hospital blanket. Elena leaned in, smoothing his hair gently. "I'm here, sweetheart." His eyelids fluttered open, revealing drowsy, familiar brown eyes. "Did you bring Robo-Rex?" he asked, his voice scratchy with sleep. Alina smiled, reaching into her bag and pulling out the well-loved stuffed dinosaur. Its fabric was worn, its seams slightly frayed from years of cuddles and adventures. "Of course I did," she whispered, placing it beside him. "He wanted to come visit you." Robert gave a weak but satisfied smile, hugging the toy close. Alina watched him, her heart aching with love and quiet fear. She had fought so hard to keep him safe, to give him the life he deserved. But now, for the first time, she had the unsettling feeling that her own past, one she had never dared to question, was about to rewrite itself. Robert hugged the worn dinosaur close to his chest, his small fingers curling around its frayed edges. "When can I go home?" he asked, his voice a sleepy whisper. Elena smoothed his hair, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Soon, sweetheart, very soon." She took a steadying breath, her heart swelling with cautious hope. "Actually, I have some wonderful news. We can schedule your surgery now." Robert blinked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "But how?" Elena smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from his cheek. "Someone sent us the money we needed." His blue eyes widened. Was it Dad? The innocent question cut deeper than it should have. Robert's father had walked away before he was even born, unwilling to face the responsibility of a child who might have medical complications. He had vanished without a trace, without a single attempt to reach out. Elena had long since stopped hoping he ever would. She forced a reassuring smile. "No, sweetie, it was someone else, a very kind person who wanted to help us." Robert considered that for a moment, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Like a superhero?" he asked, his imagination sparking to life. Elena chuckled, adjusting his blankets. "Maybe a secret superhero." Robert's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing slowing as sleep pulled him under once more. But Elena remained awake, her mind restless. Her thoughts drifted to Grayson Peterson, to the way he had stared at her medallion as if he'd seen a ghost, the hushed urgency in his voice when he had asked about it. If he was the mysterious benefactor who had left the envelope, she needed to thank him properly. And if his interest in her medallion meant something more, she needed to know why. The following morning, Grayson stood at the nurses' station in Portland Memorial Hospital, his gaze scanning the bustling floor. He had given the staff a reason for his presence, something vague about his foundation exploring a potential donation to the pediatric department. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it also wasn't the real reason he was here. "Mr. Peterson?" A voice called his name, drawing his attention. A woman in her early 60s approached, her expression professional yet warm. "I'm Dr. Mary Nova Collins," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I understand you're interested in our pediatric cardiology department." Grayson shook her hand firmly. "Yes, thank you for meeting with me." He hesitated, then added, "I'm also interested in the history of the department. I understand Zara Fletcher was a long-time nurse here?" Dr. Collins's expression softened at the name. "Zara was exceptional, one of the best we ever had. We still miss her terribly." Grayson nodded. "Did you know her personally?" "Not well," Dr. Collins admitted, "but everyone knew of Zara. She was one of those rare people who truly cared, especially about the children." Grayson hesitated before carefully choosing his next words. "I believe she may have been involved in a case that's of particular interest to me, the Coastal Highway accident, 28 years ago." Dr. Collins's brows furrowed slightly, as if searching her memory. And then, recognition flickered across her face. A flicker of recognition crossed Dr. Collins' face. "That was before my time here, but of course, everyone knows about that tragedy," she said, her tone solemn. "Nearly a dozen fatalities. Zara was working that night, yes." Grayson felt his pulse quicken. "Do you know if there were any pregnant women among the survivors?" He kept his voice as casual as he could manage. Dr. Collins gave him a curious look. "That's an oddly specific question, Mr. Peterson. May I ask why you're interested?" Grayson hesitated, considering his options, then settled on a partial truth. "My wife was one of the victims," he said quietly. "She was 5 months pregnant at the time. I was told neither she nor our child survived, but..." He let the sentence hang unfinished. The doctor's expression softened with compassion. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Grayson nodded, his throat tight. Durand Collins continued, As I said, I wasn't here then, but hospital records from that period would be archived. However, they're confidential without proper authorization. He had expected as much, but disappointment still settled in his chest. I understand. Thank you for your time. As he turned to leave, Dr. Collins hesitated before adding, "You might want to speak with Jameson Everett. He was the attending physician in the ER that night and a close friend of Zara's. He's retired now, but he still volunteers at our free clinic on Tuesdays." Grayson turned back to her, hope flickering in his chest. "Thank you. I'll do that." He headed for the elevator, his mind already racing ahead to what Dr. Everett might know. He didn't notice Elena Lewis stepping out of a room further down the hall. She watched him with a mixture of surprise and determination. Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The rain had finally stopped by the time Elena arrived at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. A thin mist curled through the headstones, lending the grounds an almost ethereal stillness. She clutched a small bouquet of calla lilies, Zara's favorite flowers, in one hand, while in her heart she carried something even more precious. The surgery was scheduled. Robert was going to get his chance. Elena approached the familiar gray granite marker and knelt before it, brushing damp leaves away from its base. "I wish you could see him, Zara," she murmured. "He's so brave." The doctor scheduled his surgery for next week. She placed the lilies gently against the stone, her fingers lingering on the cool surface. After 3 years, the ritual still felt both comforting and painful. This was where she came when she needed to feel grounded, when life's burdens threatened to pull her under. Today, though, she came with gratitude. "Someone left money for Robert's surgery," she continued, a tremor in her voice. "The exact amount we needed. I don't know who it was, but I can't help thinking you had something to do with it." A sad smile touched her lips. "Still looking out for us, even now." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, its edges softened and worn from years of handling. It showed Zara in her nurse's uniform, arm in arm with a young woman with auburn hair and bright, familiar eyes. Elena traced a fingertip over the faces, her chest tightening. "I found him, Zara," she whispered. "The man who reacted to my medallion. He was at the hospital today, asking questions about you." The mist thickened around her, the world growing quieter. For the first time in her life, she wondered if Zara's cryptic words had been more than just sentiment. Someday, it will lead you where you need to go. Maybe that day had finally come. She traced her finger over the image of the woman standing beside Zara. "I think he might know something about Aunt Mila, or maybe about my birth mother." The words felt heavier now, laden with the uncertainty that had quietly followed her all her life. Elena knelt, placing the photograph at the base of the headstone, weighing it down with a small stone to keep the breeze from carrying it away. Then she reached for the half medallion resting against her collarbone, her fingers brushing over the worn silver surface. Zara's voice echoed in her mind. "Find the other half and you'll discover your roots." Elena exhaled, steadying herself. "I'm going to find out what it all means," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Robert's sake, and for mine." Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. A different grave. Grayson stood before the small memorial stone he had commissioned 28 years ago. Unlike the surrounding graves, this one held no remains, no closure, no certainty. Millanova Peterson, beloved wife and mother to be, forever in our hearts. For nearly 3 decades, he had come here every year on the anniversary of Mila's death, carrying the same ache in his chest, the same grief in his bones. But today was different. Today, for the first time, he came with questions. With a flicker of something dangerous, Hope Grayson exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I don't know if I'm losing my mind, Dip," he murmured, "but I saw our medallion yesterday, your half of it, around a young woman's neck." He pulled his own half from his pocket, the worn silver glinting in the overcast light. He turned it over in his palm as if it might offer him answers. "She's the right age. She was raised by a nurse who worked at the hospital the night of your accident." Silence greeted him, but this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an invitation. Grayson knelt, setting a bouquet of calla lilies, the same flowers he had carried at their wedding, against the marker. As he stood, movement flickered in his peripheral vision. About 50 yards away, a young woman knelt at another grave. Elena Lewis. His pulse kicked up, his breath catching in his throat. What were the odds that they would both be here, on this day? He watched as she placed something at the base of the headstone, a photograph it seemed. Before rising to her feet, for a brief moment he hesitated. Should he approach her? What would he even say? "Excuse me, but I think you might be my daughter?" It sounded absurd. He had no proof, just coincidences and a gut feeling that refused to be ignored. But before he could decide, Elena turned and spotted him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, her expression shifted, surprise giving way to something else. Determination. She took a breath. Then she started walking toward him, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. When she turned, her breath hitched. Grayson Peterson stood at a nearby grave, his gaze locked onto her. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not the man who had reacted so strongly to her medallion, not the man who had possibly left the money for Robert's surgery, not the man who had been asking about Zara at the hospital. And now, here he was, in the one place where she felt closest to her past. Her pulse quickened as she stepped forward. "Mr. Peterson?" she called. "I thought that was you." Grayson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Miss Lewis, I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor did I expect to see you." Elena's eyes drifted to the headstone he stood before. Then she saw it Millionaire Peterson, her breath caught. The same name as her Aunt Mila. The same woman in the photograph she had just left at Zara's grave. "Mila?" she whispered, her chest tightening. "Was she your wife?" Grayson nodded slowly. "She died 28 years ago. Today is the anniversary." He gestured toward Zara's grave. "Who are you visiting?" "Zara Fletcher." Her voice was quieter now. "She raised me after my aunt died." She hesitated, then took a risk. "My aunt's name was also Mila." Grayson's face paled. "May I see the photograph you left?" Without a word, Elena led him back to Zara's headstone. The photo was still there, weighed down by the small stone. Grayson knelt, his hand trembling as he picked it up. He studied it for a long moment, his breath uneven, his fingers tightening around the worn edges. Then, he pointed to the woman beside Zara. "This woman, this is my Mila." Elena's stomach lurched. "That's impossible. That's my Aunt Mila. She lived with Zara and me until I was 16. Grayson shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "No, this is definitely my wife. I'd know her anywhere." Then, he turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, "Zara and Deb, Portland Memorial, 1997. Elena's throat went dry. 1997, Grayson's voice cracked. "But that's 2 years after the accident." Elena felt the blood rush to her ears. After the accident that was supposed to have killed her. A stunned silence settled between them. Grayson looked up at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Confusion, realization, something more. "Elena, how old are you?" 27? And your birthday?" She swallowed. "May 16, 1999. Grayson's knees seemed to give out as he sank onto the damp grass, the color draining from his face. The accident was November 3, 1998. His voice was barely a whisper. Mila was 5 months pregnant. Elena's hand went instinctively to the medallion at her neck. Her mind raced, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Mr. Peterson, why did you react that way when you saw my necklace yesterday?" Grayson didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around something cool and familiar. Then, wordlessly, he pulled out his half of the St. Jude medallion and held it up next to hers. Elena gasped as the two medallion halves aligned perfectly, the jagged edges fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. As one, they formed a complete image of St. Jude. Beneath it, an inscription that had been fragmented, illegible, for decades, now read in its entirety. "True love always finds its way back." A shiver ran through her. Grayson's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mila and I split this medallion the day before she left for her trip. It was a promise that we'd always find our way back to each other." Elena took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. "This doesn't make sense," she said, shaking her head. "My Aunt Mila couldn't have been your wife. She would have told me. Zara would have told me." Grayson's gaze softened. Unless she couldn't. The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Alina, I was told that both Mila and our unborn child died in that accident. He swallowed hard. But what if they didn't? What if Mila survived, but couldn't remember who she was? What if you are our child? Alina staggered back as if the earth beneath her feet had suddenly tilted. No. Her voice was barely more than a breath. That's crazy. She shook her head, trying to reject the sheer impossibility of it. I had a normal childhood. I grew up with Zara and Aunt Mila. I have memories. Grayson studied her carefully. Beginning when? Elena's mind raced backward, searching, grasping, but her earliest clear memories only reached as far back as when she was 4 or 5. Before that, nothing but blurry impressions, hazy warmth, voices she couldn't quite place. This is insane. Her breath came faster now, shallow. You're a stranger. You can't just show up and claim to be my father, based on half a necklace and some wild theory. Grayson exhaled, nodding. I know how it sounds, but the coincidences are too significant to ignore. Your age, the medallion, the fact that you were raised by a nurse who worked at the hospital the night of the accident. And now this. He held up the photograph. Elena's gaze locked onto the image. Mila, the woman she had always known as her aunt. She remembered how Mila would sometimes stare at nothing, a faraway look in her eyes, like she was trying to grasp something just beyond reach. Something long forgotten, a sharp ache lodged in Elena's chest. I need to go. The words came out abruptly, her instincts screaming at her to run. My son needs me. Elena, please. Grayson stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. At least take my card. If you change your mind, if you want to talk. She hesitated, then, without looking, she snatched the business card from his hand and shoved it into her pocket. I have to go. She turned and hurried away, each step feeling like she was trying to outrun a reality she wasn't ready to face. But even as she left, she couldn't shake the image in her mind. 2 medallion halves fitting together, a message completed after nearly 3 decades behind her. Grayson remained kneeling at Zara Fletcher's grave, staring at the photograph in his hands. The woman he had mourned for 28 years, alive and smiling beside the nurse who had raised his daughter Elena. Couldn't remember the drive home from the cemetery, a moment she had been standing in front of Grayson, her world tilting beneath her feet. The next, she was sitting in the parking lot of her apartment building, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. This is crazy, she whispered, completely insane, and yet, the medallion pieces had fit together perfectly. The inscription, the fragmented words on each half, had formed a coherent message when joined. True love always finds its way back. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out Grayson Peterson's business card. CEO of Peterson Development Group, a Portland address, a phone number, nothing extraordinary about it, and yet, holding it felt like gripping a stick of dynamite. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. The hospital. Elena's breath caught as she answered, Mrs. Lewis. Dr. Vivian would like to speak with you about Robert's pre-surgical consultation tomorrow. Robert. His surgery. That was what mattered. Not some wild, impossible story from a stranger in a cemetery. Yes, of course, she said automatically. Tell him I'll be there at whatever time works. As the call ended, reality came crashing back. Robert needed her, this insane theory, did not. And yet, November 4th, 1998. The windshield wipers struggled against the torrential downpour as Mila Peterson navigated the twisting coastal highway. She shouldn't have come, Grayson had warned her about the storm. Your parents can wait another weekend to see us, he'd said that morning, concern etched in his face. Mom's birthday is tomorrow, Mila had countered, resting a hand on her swollen belly. I want to give her the news in person. Besides, the baby's been kicking up a storm. I think he or she is excited to meet Grandma and Grandpa now. She had smiled then. Now, as lightning slashed the sky, illuminating the angry Pacific to her right, her stomach clenched. She had overestimated herself and underestimated the storm. The road was treacherous, slick with rain. Visibility was dismal. She eased off the accelerator, white-knuckling the wheel as she focused on the yellow dividing lines. Her hand drifted to the half medallion at her neck, Grayson had the other half, a silly, romantic gesture he had called it. But it comforted her now, as though it somehow tethered her to him across the miles. Then, headlights. Bright, blinding, too close. Mila's heart slammed into her ribs, a truck on her side of the road, barreling toward her too fast on the wet pavement. Her body reacted before her mind could. She yanked the wheel, the tires lost traction. The car slid, then spun. For one terrifying instant, the guardrail loomed ahead, illuminated by her headlights. And then, nothing. Portland Memorial Hospital, emergency room. Chaos rippled through the ER. A multi-vehicle accident on the coastal highway had sent a flood of critically injured victims their way, with more still en route. Another incoming, a paramedic shouted as they burst through the doors, wheeling in a stretcher. Nurse Zara Fletcher rushed forward. The patient, a woman, unconscious, blood matting her auburn hair, lay motionless. Then Zara saw it. Her belly swollen, at least 5 or 6 months pregnant. Trauma room 3, Zara called, moving swiftly to help guide the stretcher. Page Dr. Everett, stat, pregnant female with head trauma. As they transferred the woman onto the exam table, Zara's gaze flickered to the silver chain around her neck. She reached out, gently moving it aside to clear the area for cardiac leads, and froze. Dangling from the chain was half of a St. Jude medallion. A chill ran down her spine. BP dropping, another nurse warned. Heartbeat is irregular. Dr. Jameson Everett stormed in, his sharp eyes scanning the monitors. Get an ultrasound now. The next several minutes blurred into controlled chaos. The injuries were severe. Head trauma, internal bleeding, a fractured femur, and the baby was in distress. Dr. Everett's voice was grim, decisive. We need to do an emergency C-section. The baby won't survive otherwise, and we might lose her too if we wait. Zara stayed by the woman's side through the procedure. The baby, a girl, was tiny, fragile, but alive. She needed immediate specialized care. Then, wait, one of the doctors frowned at the monitor. There's another heartbeat. Zara's breath caught. Twins. But the second heartbeat was weak. The boy was even smaller than his sister, his body struggling against impossible odds. Despite their efforts, they couldn't save him. The ER team pushed forward, working to stabilize the mother. Zara, meanwhile, was tasked with identifying the patient. She searched through the wreckage, salvaged purse, looking for anything that might tell them who she was. A driver's license. The name printed across it made her heart stop. Mila Peterson. And beneath it, tucked into the worn leather, a photograph. A smiling woman with the same auburn hair standing beside a handsome man, her husband presumably. Zara swallowed hard. She set them aside for the notification team, her mind already racing with unspoken questions. Portland Memorial Hospital, hours after the accident. Long past the end of her shift, Zara Fletcher found herself lingering in the NICU, watching over the tiny baby girl. She shouldn't have still been here. Exhaustion tugged at her. But something about this infant, so small, so fragile, made it impossible to walk away. Then, a commotion erupted in the waiting area. A man's desperate voice carried over the noise. My wife was in an accident on the coastal highway, Mila Peterson. Someone called me, but they wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. A pause, a sharp breath. Please, I need to know if she's alive, Zara turned. She recognized him instantly from the photograph. Grayson Peterson, Mila's husband. She was about to step forward when Dr. Everett reached him first. Zara couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw it. The exact moment when Grayson Peterson's world collapsed. His face went blank, his body staggering backward as if struck. Then, he sank into a chair, his head falling into his hands. A man destroyed. Later, Zara learned the truth, the terrible mistake. In the chaos of the mass casualty event, records had been mixed up. A victim who had died on arrival had been misidentified as Mila Peterson. By the time the error was discovered, it was too late. Grayson Peterson had already been told that his wife and unborn child were dead. While the real Mila Peterson lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, her name lost in the confusion. And when she finally regained consciousness 3 weeks later, she remembered nothing. Not who she was, not the accident, not the tiny baby girl she had given birth to present day. Elena stared at the photograph on her coffee table. Zara and Aunt Mila, smiling in their hospital scrubs. But was that really who they had been? Could the woman she had known as her aunt have actually been her mother? Could Grayson Peterson, a stranger she had met only yesterday, truly be her father? She searched her memories, sifting through the fragments of her childhood. Mila had always been distant, unlike Zara. Kind but withdrawn, prone to headaches, to moments of disorientation. Zara had always explained it away. Deb has an artistic temperament, she'd said, but what if it had been something else? What if it had been the lingering effects of brain trauma? Elena swallowed hard, remembering the day Mila died. That second accident, she had been 15. She could still feel Zara's arms around her, still hear the soft murmurs of comfort as she cried at the funeral. If Mila had been her biological mother, then why had Zara never told her? Unless she had a reason not to. Elena's phone rang. She jumped, heart racing. This time it wasn't the hospital. It was Carol, from the cafe. "Jen, there's a man here asking for you. That businessman from yesterday. Peterson. Should I tell him you're not available?" Elena closed her eyes, inhaled deeply. Then, "No," she said finally, voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Tell him I'll be there in 20 minutes. Golden Memories Cafe." When Elena arrived at Golden Memories, she spotted Grayson immediately. He was sitting at the same table as the day before, nursing a cup of coffee, his fingers absently tracing the rim of the mug. The moment he saw her, his face lit up, not with certainty but hope. And that hope made something inside her tighten, a painful, reluctant squeeze of her heart. "Thank you for coming," he said as she slid into the seat across from him. "I know this is all overwhelming." "That's putting it mildly," Elena exhaled, steadying herself. "Look, Mr. Peterson, Grayson, please." She hesitated. Then, "Grayson." The name felt strange on her tongue, yet oddly familiar, like something she should have always known. "I need you to understand something." Her voice was firm, though her hands tightened around the edge of the table. "Even if what you're suggesting is true, and I'm not saying I believe it is, I had a life before today. I had a mother and an aunt who raised me. I have a son who needs me. I can't just..." She gestured helplessly, at a loss for words. "I understand," Grayson said quietly. "I'm not trying to disrupt your life, but I've spent 27 years believing my wife and child died in that accident. If there's even a possibility that you're my daughter, I need to know." Elena studied him, searching his features for something familiar. His eyes. A different color from hers, yet something about their shape stirred a distant recognition. "How would we even know for sure?" she asked finally. "A DNA test," Grayson said. "That would be definitive, but there might be other signs. You mentioned your Aunt Mila lived with you until you were 15. What happened to her?" Elena swallowed hard. "She died in a car accident." The words felt bitter on her tongue. Ironic, isn't it? She was on her way to Boston for some art exhibition. Grayson's expression shifted, something dark flickering in his gaze. "Boston," he repeated, his voice edged with something unreadable. "I lived in Boston from 2000 to 2012. My company was headquartered there before I moved operations back to Portland." A chill ran through Elena. "The accident was in 2014, she murmured. Zara said Aunt Mila had been having strange dreams, memories coming back to her. She said she needed to go to Boston to find something she'd lost." They stared at each other, the weight of the revelation suffocating. Had Mila finally remembered? Had she been on her way to find Grayson when fate cruelly intervened a second time? Elena's fingers trembled against the edge of the table. "There's more," she said slowly, the final piece falling into place. "I have a heart condition, the same one my son has. The doctors said it's genetic, but neither Zara nor Aunt Mila had it. They always told me it must have come from my biological father." Grayson's face went pale. "My father died of heart failure at 42, he said. It runs in the Peterson family." The air left Elena's lungs. Her world had already been shifting, but now it felt like it was coming apart entirely. This wasn't just speculation anymore. This was real. She pushed back her chair, needing space, air, time to think. "I need time to process this," she said, rising to her feet. And I need to focus on Robert's surgery. After that, maybe we can talk about a DNA test." Grayson nodded, his expression understanding. "Of course, your son comes first. But Elena?" He hesitated, his voice softer now. "Whether or not you choose to pursue this further, please know, I was the one who left the money for Robert's surgery. Not out of any expectation, but because it was the right thing to do." Elena's breath hitched. She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She only nodded, then turned toward the door. She was almost outside when Grayson's voice stopped her one last time. "Elena, what's your son's full name?" She hesitated, just for a moment, then looked back. Robert Grayson Lewis." A hush fell between them. A name chosen subconsciously without thought. A name that had carried the truth all along. The box. The memory struck suddenly, sharp and undeniable, just as Elena was packing Robert's backpack for his hospital stay. Her hands stilled, clutching his pajamas, her mind elsewhere. The box. Zara's final gift. A cherry wood box with carved flowers on the lid, identical to the delicate engraving on the small metal tin where she had kept Robert's surgery fund. She had placed it in the back of her closet after Zara's death, too consumed by grief to open it, too overwhelmed to face whatever lay inside. Only once had she looked, just long enough to see the medallion resting inside. Now, she remembered. "When the halves meet, open the box and you'll find your roots," Zara had whispered in those final days. At the time, Elena had dismissed it as the pain medication talking. Now, those words held an entirely new meaning. She dropped the pajamas into the backpack, heart pounding, and then she rushed to her bedroom. Pushing aside hanging clothes and stacked shoeboxes, her fingers brushed against wood. She pulled it free. A rectangular wooden box, its surface smooth yet intricate, cherry blossoms etched into the lid. Delicate, timeless. Elena carried it to her bed with trembling hands. For 3 years, it had remained untouched. A piece of Zara, sealed away in time. Now it might hold answers to questions she had never thought to ask. She ran her fingers over the brass lock. Zara had given her the key separately, tucked on a chain inside her jewelry box. Now, retrieving it, she sat cross-legged on the bed. The box before her, a Pandora's box of memories, secrets, and truths. She exhaled. "Here goes nothing." The key slid into the lock. A soft click. Inside, carefully preserved, were photographs, letters, a small diary bound in faded blue leather, and several sealed envelopes, their official stamps long since yellowed with age. Elena lifted the first photograph and gasped. The truth unfolds. The photograph trembled in Elena's hands. A hospital room, a much younger Zara standing beside a bed, her face tender yet tense. And in that bed, Milla pale, thin, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her arms cradled a newborn wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Elena's breath caught. Slowly, she turned the photograph over. The handwriting was unmistakable. Zara's, neat and precise. Milla and Elena, May 16, 1999, her birthday. A chill ran through her, settling deep in her bones. With shaking fingers, Elena sifted through the other items, more photos, Milla holding baby Elena, Zara bathing toddler Elena, her laughter frozen in time. A birthday party, Elena at 2, maybe 3, Zara and Milla beside her, the only family she had ever known. She reached for an envelope, the words hospital records scrawled across the front. Inside, a birth certificate. Elena's eyes scanned the document frantically. Mother, Jane Doe. Identity unknown. Father, unknown. Birth date, May 16, 1999. Attending physician, Dr. Jameson Everett. Attending nurse, Zara Flecker. Her breath hitched. Another document. This document, Zane legally. A name change form dated 6 months later. It changed Jane Doe to Milla Fletcher Zara. Zara Fletcher was listed as her sister. The realization struck like a thunderclap. They created a new identity for her, she whispered. A life rewritten, a truth buried. The final item in the box was the blue diary. Its cover faded, its spine worn. Elena lifted it with reverence, her fingers brushing across its surface. She knew the handwriting before she even opened it. Zara's, and inside the answers she had never known to seek. Zara's confession. November 4th, 1998. The accident victims keep arriving. So much tragedy tonight. The pregnant woman, Mila Peterson, delivered twins by emergency C-section. The boy didn't make it. The girl is tiny but fighting. I've been checking on her all night. Somehow, in all the chaos, Mr. Peterson was told his wife and baby died. By the time we realized the mistake, he was gone. Devastated. Dev remains unconscious. Her prognosis is uncertain. November 11th, 1998. Mila opened her eyes today, but there's nothing there. No recognition. No past. The neurologist says it's severe retrograde amnesia. She doesn't know her name, doesn't remember being pregnant. I visit her every day. Something about her reminds me of Martha, before cancer took her last year. I can't explain it, but I feel responsible for her somehow. The entries continued, detailing Mila's slow recovery and Zara's growing attachment to both mother and child. Elena read with mounting disbelief as Zara described her fateful decision to help Mila establish a new identity, to rewrite her past as her sister-in-law, May 16, 1999. Elena Rose was born today, perfect in every way. Mila may not remember her past, but she already loves this child with her whole heart. I told the adoption agency I'd handle everything, that my sister Mila just needed help with the paperwork. I know what I'm doing is wrong, legally, morally. I should be trying to reunite Mila with her husband, but he's already mourned and moved on. His company relocated to Boston last month. Would reopening this wound help anyone? I don't think so. And the truth is, I've grown to love them both too much. Is it selfish to keep this makeshift family together? Elena's hands shook as she turned the pages. Zara's guilt, her self-doubt, her ultimate conviction that she was doing what was best for everyone. 2006. Elena asked about her father today. Mila looked to me, panic. We've decided to tell her he was a brief relationship. A good man, gone before she was born. The lies are getting harder to keep straight. Sometimes I dream that the truth comes out, that we're all found out as frauds, but then I look at Elena's smile, at how happy we are together, and I tell myself, we made the right choice. The final entries broke her heart. 2014. Mila's been having dreams, memories. Yesterday, she asked about Boston. Have you ever been there, she said. There was something in her eyes, a spark of her old self, perhaps. She says she needs to go to find something she's lost. I'm terrified. 15 years. I've kept this secret for 15 years. What if she remembers? What if she hates me for what I've done? But I can't stop her. Mila. Maybe it's time the truth came out. A mother's last promise. The next diary entry was tear-stained. Mila is gone. The accident was so sudden, so senseless, another car crash taking her away forever. Elena is devastated. I can't tell her the truth now. It would be too much for her to bear. Mila someday, when she's older, stronger. For now, I will continue to be the mother she needs. Elena closed the diary, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face. The final entry was dated just weeks before Zara's cancer diagnosis. She never got the chance. She never told the truth. The sharp trill of her phone yanked her back to reality, the hospital. Elena's breath caught as she answered. Miss Lewis, it's Dr. Vivienne. I'm afraid we need you to come in right away. Robert's condition has deteriorated. His heart rhythm is irregular, and we may need to move up the surgery. Elena's world narrowed to a single point of focus. Robert. Nothing else mattered. I'm on my way, she said, already grabbing her coat. Zara's box lay scattered across the bed, forgotten. A call for help. Grayson paced the hospital corridor. He'd rushed over the moment Elena called. They had barely spoken since their meeting at the cafe, but her voice on the phone, frantic, shaken. Robert's worse. They're taking him into surgery now. I don't know what to do. Would you mind coming? I can't be alone. The words had stunned him, not because she needed him, but because for the first time she had let him in. And he hadn't hesitated. Standing together, whatever their complicated history, whatever unanswered questions lingered between them right now, Elena needed support, and Grayson was determined to be there. He watched her through the waiting room doorway. He was hunched over hospital paperwork, her shoulders tense, her expression guarded. But what struck him most wasn't the potential resemblance to himself or Mila. It was the way she carried herself, the determined set of her jaw, the quiet strength in her posture. It was familiar. It was undeniable. "Mr. Peterson?" Grayson turned as a doctor approached, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes. How's Robert?" "I'm Dr. Vivienne. Robert's being prepped for surgery now." A brief pause. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something. Ms. Lewis mentioned a family history of congenital heart defects." Grayson nodded, his throat tightening. "On my side, yes. My father had a similar condition. If Alina is indeed my daughter, Robert would be my grandson." Dr. Vivienne's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he kept his expression professional. "That information could be invaluable. Do you know the specific variation of the defect that affected your father?" Grayson didn't hesitate. "I have his complete medical history. After his death, I had all his records digitized. I'll have my assistant send them over immediately." The doctor's relief was evident. "That could significantly improve our approach to Robert's procedure. Thank you." As Dr. Vivienne walked away, Grayson made a quick call to his assistant. Then he crossed the waiting room. Elena had finished with the paperwork. She sat staring blankly at the wall, her hands clenched in her lap. Grayson took the seat beside her. "I've sent over my father's medical records," he said quietly. "Dr. Vivienne thinks they might help with Robert's surgery." Elena turned to him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, "Thank you for coming." A pause. "And for that, the weight of the past." Elena hesitated, then reached into her bag, fingers brushing against worn leather. Slowly, she pulled out the blue diary, the one that had rewritten everything she thought she knew. "I found this in a box Zara left for me." Her voice was quiet but steady. "You should read it. It explains everything." Grayson accepted the diary with careful hands, his expression unreadable. "They're taking him into surgery now," Elena continued, her grip tightening around the bag in her lap. "It'll be several hours. There's time for you to read it." He nodded, flipping open the first page. Elena leaned back, closing her eyes. The weight of unspoken words settled between them. For now, they sat together, bound by concern for Robert and the slow unraveling of a secret 27 years in the making. The surgical waiting room was eerily still. The rhythmic beeping from the nurse's station, the faint hum of a muted television, these were the only sounds as Grayson read. With each page, his emotions shifted. Disbelief, then understanding, and finally, a profound grief for the years lost. When he closed the diary, his cheeks were damp with tears. He looked over at Elena. She had been watching him, her expression unreadable, her emotions carefully contained. Years of being a single mother had taught her that skill. Right now, Robert was the only thing that mattered. All this time, Grayson's voice was barely a whisper. "She was alive, you were alive," Elena nodded. "Zara thought she was doing the right thing," she said finally. "She saw a woman with no memory, a newborn who needed care, and she made a choice." Grayson's jaw tightened. "A choice that kept me from my family for 27 years. A flicker of bitterness crept into his voice. Elena exhaled slowly, then met his gaze. "Would you have preferred she left Mila alone, confused with no identity?" A beat of silence, then, "And a premature baby to care for." Unraveling the years, Grayson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, of course not. I'm grateful she cared for both of you. I just wish..." He trailed off, the words tangling in his throat. How could he explain the ache of lost time? The weight of knowing he'd mourn a wife who had still been alive. Elena watched him, her expression softer now. "That she'd found a way to tell you," she finished. Her voice held no accusation, only a quiet sadness. "I wish that too." She glanced at the clock. "Robert's only been in surgery for an hour. We have a long wait ahead." Grayson nodded, then shifted in his seat. "Tell me about him." Elena blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Robert?" "Yeah," he said, setting the diary aside. "What's he like?" For the first time that night, a genuine smile softened her tense features. "He's amazing. So brave, so curious about everything. He loves dinosaurs and space. He wants to be a paleontologist who discovers fossils on Mars. Her voice warmed, but then, just as quickly, the light dimmed. Sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. It waits, quietly, for the right moment to resurface. A single medallion, a stranger's kindness, a forgotten box. And suddenly, the lines between coincidence and destiny begin to blur. Elena Lewis walked into that day believing she was alone, a struggling mother fighting to save her son. But by nightfall, a door to the truth had creaked open, a truth that could redefine everything: her past, her family, her identity. And what about Grayson Peterson, a man who thought he had lost everything, now standing at the edge of something he never dared to hope for: a second chance? Sometimes, the answers we seek aren't found in the facts we know, but in the feelings we can't ignore. Love, loss, and fate are often written in the margins of our stories, waiting for us to read between the lines. But what happens when the truth finally takes shape? Will Elena embrace the man who might be her father, or walk away from a past she never asked to inherit? And as Robert is wheeled into surgery, what secret, still hidden, will emerge next? In Part 2, Everything Changes. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the moment that turns suspicion into certainty and strangers into family.